Okay, we're a couple of minutes past 7 now, so we will get started. Just waiting for a few more students to join, so we'll get cracking anyway, and we hopefully they shouldn't miss too much. My name is Mark Williams. I work here at Medical Projects. We help students on their journey towards medical school, and tonight we're going to be looking at part of the UCAT. So this specifically the situational judgment part. It tends to be one of those sections that's not very well understood and can be really confusing. So we just wanted to kind of have a look at this section in a bit more detail. I think it's one of the sections that has one of the greatest potential room for improvement as well when you're practicing. So if you can kind of nail some of these questions down, then you can really help your UCAT score. I'm joined by Matthew as well. Hi, Matthew. How are you doing?
Yeah, good, thank you. So my name is Matthew. I'm a medical student at King's.
And you're saying you just finished your exams yesterday. Is that right?
Yeah, so I've just finished my second year. Yeah.
Cool. So, and how did the exams go? Tough or okay?
Hopefully, okay. We'll see.
Good. Yeah, so I mean, you're going to talk a little bit about the situational judgment test. I've just got a couple of little housekeeping slides just so everybody knows what's kind of going on, and then I'll basically hand over to you and let you kind of talk through some of this section. I know you're going to go through a few questions as well and give people a few examples. So hopefully students should understand it a bit more and have some really good examples in the next kind of half an hour or so. Just on this, we will be all completely wrapped up kind of before 8 o'clock. We really appreciate that, joining us for an hour on a Wednesday evening. We really appreciate that, but we'll keep the time tight so we're not taking over your entire evening. We will send a recording and a copy of the slides out as well for any students that want them. And we'll have a kind of 20-25 minutes of talking through the SJT bit, and then we'll have approximately 20-25 minutes Q&A at the end as well. For the Q&A system, if you've not used it before, you can basically use the upvote system, which means that we can bring the most popular question to the top. So if somebody else has already asked a question, you just hit the thumbs up button and it brings to the top so we can answer the most popular questions. And we'll be using polls as well, because we'll be throwing a few different questions at you just to kind of test where you're at with some of the SJT stuff, and hopefully you can kind of pick it up as we go along. Cool. I think this is basically over to you. I'll control all the slides. Just let me know when you want to kind of move things on, or if you want polls. And I'll kind of jump back into the Q&A bit as well.
Brilliant. Thanks, Mark. So as I said, guys, my name's Matthew. I've just finished my second year here at King's. And just a little bit about me. I grew up I'm from London originally. I went to school in London. And I took the UCAT back in 2018, although it was called the UCAT back then. But essentially, it's the same thing. It's just a sort of rebranding of the name of the test. Next slide, please. So, and just before I begin, I should say I know a lot of you are putting in questions in the chat. We are doing a proper Q&A at the end, so I'll do my best to answer as many questions as possible at the end, but after I've presented my main bit here, if that's okay. So what is the situational judgment section? Well, I imagine most of you will be familiar with this part of the UCAT exam. It's often shortened to the SJT in books, resources, or maybe your school teachers or the people in your schools in charge of medical school applications may have mentioned it. But essentially, it's the last part of the UCAT that you do, and it's a sort of way to assess your suitability to understand ethical dilemmas, sort of common ethical sort of moral problems that come up in sort of everyday life as either a medical student or a doctor once you qualify. And then just to quote the UCAT consortium website, their official website, and you can find all of this on their website, the SJT measures your capacity to understand real world situations and to identify critical factors and appropriate behavior in dealing with them. I mean, that's really just a sort of long-winded encapsulation of what I just said. And it's important to note also, there are 69 questions in total, but those are split up based on 22 scenarios. And the more observant amongst you will realize that 22 doesn't go into 69, and that's true. So not every situation will have the same amount, not every scenario will have the same amount of questions attached to it. And if that doesn't make sense now, it will later when I explain more about the nature of the questions involved. And importantly, you have 26 minutes to complete this section rather. I mean, timing is something that is very important in the UCAT exam, and it's something I'll be touching over a bit later on in this presentation as well. But just bear those things in mind. And again, you can freely find this information on the UCAT Consortium website, and I'd very much recommend doing the same thing for the other sections of the UCAT as well. Next slide, please. So your SJT mark is actually put separately on your UCAT score. So for those of you that don't know, the rest of the exam, the rest of the UCAT is split into 4 sections, and you get an overall score. Some people then like to further divide that into 4 to give you a kind of mean average score, or at least people used to do that when I did the test. But the SJT mark, unlike that score, it's done in a band system, with band 1 being the best, i.e. You have a sort of thorough understanding of ethical dilemmas and ethical situations, and you're able to act appropriately. And band 4 really being the worst. I must say, actually, band, none of you guys should be aiming for band 4. I think people that I haven't personally known many people that have got band 4s, but and as I put in the slide, it's quite important for the medical schools to know that you have some kind of knowledge and understanding and capacity to learn about ethical dilemmas and problems, as it's extremely important. And as I've said here, you really want to be at least aiming for a band 2. I think most people, if I'm not mistaken, either get a band 2 or band 1. As most medical schools will probably reject you if you're getting a band 3 or 4. I have known people to be admitted to band 3s, but that's providing it's sort of dependent on 2 main things really. That the university you're applying to sort of counts the overall score more, and they weigh that more in their scoring matrix, or they certain universities like Edinburgh care more about the SJT than others. So what I mean to say is that, and this may have changed, and it's important to mention it may have changed, but back when I was applying, Edinburgh didn't care at all about the score, the actual overall score that I've just mentioned. I've used an example of 2,800 here. They only really cared about the sort of band you got on the SJT, and they were really looking for a band 1. So I guess what I mean to say is that it really is an important part of the exam, and it can't help. It will never not help your application. It's always a really important part of it. Next slide, please. So this is just an example of what I was talking about, and this is how it will appear after you guys take the exam. So you've got the 4 sections here split up. You've got your overall score. If you divide that by 4, you get a mean average of all the sections that you took. And then the situational judgment at the bottom, which is what we're focusing on today. And you can see in this, I think this is an imaginary person. This is just from the website, but you can see in band 1, the consortium have said that those in band 1 demonstrate an excellent level of performance, showing similar judgment in most cases to the panel of experts. This is again something I'll briefly touch upon later, but the way that the consortium put together the SJT is it is what it says on the tin, and it is what it says on this piece of paper. They are literally a panel of, it's a multidisciplinary panel, I believe. I think it's professors of medicine. You've got sort of high-powered academic nurses there, other healthcare professionals, and academics working on admissions tests and in education as well. And they all come together in a panel, and given every situation and every scenario that comes up, they amongst themselves go ahead and select what they think is the most correct answer. And I do stress most correct, because in a lot of the situations that they give you, there isn't necessarily a clear-cut black and white answer, and you really have to sort of use your your acumen and your reasoning to decide what is the best way forward. Next slide, please. So how does one prepare for this test? Well, it's important to realize that you don't, and I can't stress this enough, you really do not need any either scientific or medical scientific knowledge in order to answer the questions correctly. And actually the same can be said for the other sections of the UCAT. This test is an admissions test. It's a standardized test. People have to do them in all different sort of lines of employment. It's not just it's not just for medical school. People that work for companies, I'll have to do it when I apply for my sort of jobs as a junior doctor and for higher specialty training as well. So it's important to realize for this test, you really don't need to be reading a kind of textbook about biology or physiology or something. It's got nothing to do with it. And that's especially relevant to this section that we're discussing today. So what I would recommend in regards to preparing for this part of the UCAT, and I'm not going to talk about the other parts today, but medical projects, there are various different schemes and various different other webinars that we're holding here that we'll touch upon those other areas. But what I would say for the SJT, you should really go out of your way to use different resources. So you need to be able to familiarize yourself with, as I put here, a diverse range of ethical scenarios, which will broaden your overall understanding of the type of answers the assessment board are looking for. And that also, again, touches back to what I was saying. These answers, these sort of seemingly correct answers, and in most cases they are, correct, having done it myself, have been agreed on by a sort of panel, a board of experts. And you'll find that the more that you practice the styles of questions that they put on this part of the test, the more that you familiarize yourself with it and the better you end up doing. Another thing I would say is that there are really a variety of other online book-based resources, and certainly, as I said, there's a crash course here at Medical Projects. So it's really good to sort of use a diverse range of things to revise from. Next slide, please. So as I said, really the main point is that you practice. And I appreciate that I haven't, been specific as to what resources you should use. So I could name a few now. I mean, there's different UCAT books. I'm sure you guys have all seen the ones with, 750 questions and whatever. There is a word of warning with those books. In my experience, the style of the questions that they ask, and it's less so much for the SJT, but it's still relevant, is subtly different from the actual questions that come up in the exam itself, in the test center. The people that write these books with, and I'm sure you guys know what I'm talking about, the ones with the green covers, and if you don't, they're sort of easily Googleable and easy to buy and relatively cheap. But the people that write these books are not people that are involved with the assessment board. They're people that have sort of objectively looked at questions or past questions themselves and come up with stuff that they think is representative of that. And a lot of the time, as I said, it's subtly different. So it's really important to make sure you revise from the right resources as well. And I really would recommend the sort of crash course here at Medical Projects. And there's also a load of different other online resources that you guys can use. The one thing I would say about the nature of your practice and the nature of your revision, and again, I stress you can revise for this test. It's not, as I said before, it's not something that you're going to be revising facts from a textbook about. You're going to be revising and practicing your technique. And the more you do that, the better you'll get. And I put this phrase little and often here, and I think it's very much, it's very relevant. It's really important to do little and often in the sort of weeks and months before you sit the test, or in, for example, free periods, or if you have some time at home after you've done your homework in the evening, for example. And the last thing I would say is that in regards to actually the build up to your UCAT, in the last sort of 2 weeks, I would really recommend ramping up your practice so that you peak at the right time. Next slide, please. Right, so without further ado then, we're going to move on quickly to some questions. And these are actual question bank questions, so they're legitimate UCAT SJT questions. And just before we start, I'll just give a brief summary of what is going on here and what you can expect to find in the exam itself. So as you can see, you'll be given a blurb like this, and you'll see it at the top of your screen, and you'll be able to scroll down. So you'll see this blurb initially, and then there'll be a load of follow-up questions, which you'll see on the later slides, because we're going to do the questions together. But essentially, you'll see this blurb, you'll have a bit of time to read it. And I'd recommend not skim reading. I'd recommend reading it properly, not taking too much time. It's important to remember you only have 26 minutes to answer not a lot of questions at all. But just get in your head a rough idea of the main points in this case. And without giving too much away, I'll quickly go over this one now. So Shakim, a junior doctor at the cardiac care unit, is working under a lot of pressure today due to a high volume of work, since one of his seniors is ill and has had to stay home. At 3 o'clock, he receives a call from Elaine, who is a member of the surgical team, and she explains that they're running behind schedule with today's surgical procedures. So Shakim is asked to inform Benjamin, so Benjamin's a patient here, he's the last patient on the list for the particular surgical procedure today, and his surgery is being postponed until tomorrow morning. Rescheduling the surgery makes no difference to Benjamin's safety, but he has been very anxious about the situation and mentioned multiple times that he would like to get it over and done with. So without giving too much away, just scanning that at the top is really, really important. So what are the main points? Well, you're a junior doctor, your name's Shakim. You're currently under quite a lot of stress. There's a high volume of work and you don't have much time, and you've been called by a member of a surgical team. This question assumes you're not sort of member of that team, you're a member of the cardiac team, and you're asked to inform a patient that his surgery is going to be postponed. And also the patient is quite anxious about this. So bearing all of that in mind, Mark, do you have the poll that we can put up?
Yeah, sure. Just give me 1 second. Let me just see if this works.
So Mark's just putting up a poll now for you guys to see. Brilliant. Okay. So yeah. So next slide, please. So bearing all of this in mind, so just to remind you, your name's Shakim, you're a junior doctor. You're quite stressed out, and you've been asked to tell this patient that their surgery has been postponed tomorrow. So bearing this in mind, how appropriate are each of the following responses in this situation? So the first one, you have to explain to Benjamin why his surgery can't take place today. Out of those 4, is it very appropriate to very inappropriate?
We'll just give it maybe another kind of 20 or 30 seconds, maybe 20 seconds, just while all the votes come in. We're up to nearly 300.
I think someone's just requested to go back to the previous slide.
I can't do that without clicking on the slides. And then if I click on the slides, it's going to bring the answer up.
Okay. I'll just remind you guys. So your name's Shakim. You're a junior doctor working in the cardiac care unit. You're extremely busy. Your consultant's taken sick leave, and you've been asked by a member of the surgical team to go and see a patient who is last on the list, and his operation is being postponed until tomorrow. So you're essentially having to break this news to him that his operation is being postponed, and this patient's quite anxious and he wanted to get it out of the way.
Right, I think most of the votes are in, so I can share the results. Can you see those on your screen as well?
I can, yeah. Brilliant, yeah. So I think we can reveal the answer. So very good. So most of you guys put A, very appropriate, which is the right answer, and most of you that didn't put A put B. I can see why those of you that put B did. again, as I say, a lot of these questions aren't necessarily clear cut, but there is a reason in this case why it's very inappropriate for Benjamin. And the reason is this: in any kind of surgery or any kind of procedural part of medicine, you have to firstly gain the informed consent of the patient to go ahead with the procedure in the first place, which is something that's presumably been done earlier on in the day. But also, if there are any complications or any, anything that has either gone wrong or anything that could potentially go wrong, or anything that changes within the time you consented the patient to the present, then you always need to, you're legally obliged to tell the patient what has gone wrong. And this is a typical example of that. So you're morally and legally obliged to tell Benjamin and explain to him and give him the sort of ability to make an informed decision why his surgery can't take place today. And this is an example of why I really would recommend reading, or just at least having a browse through the sort of the GMC ideal practice guidelines. Again, they're readily available to find on the internet, because a lot of the situations in the SJT touch upon topics that are discussed there. Okay, so I think we can move on to the next question, please. Right, so the next part, tell Benjamin to go home. Yeah, sorry, Jennifer. Yeah, you're right. Good medical practice. My bad. So tell Benjamin to go home, and in case he has any questions, someone will answer them tomorrow before the surgery. So how appropriate is this? And just to remind you, your name Shakim. Yes, they can be the same potentially. And just to remind you, your name's Shakim. You're working in the cardiac care unit, and this patient, you've been asked to go and tell the patient that his surgery is being postponed.
Got a much more balanced range of answers on this one, so I think this is a bit more tricky for them.
Yeah, this is a slightly harder one.
I'll just give it a couple more seconds, then I'll launch results. Can you see those?
Yeah, I can. Okay, so happy to reveal the answer then. So the answer to this is actually very inappropriate. And just looking at the results, again, it was more of an even spread, but actually the most voted one was inappropriate, but not awful. Again, I can see why you guys voted for that. And the thing is, a lot of the time with these questions in real life, in a sort of real life setting, i.e. you are a doctor in real life, a lot of what comes up is not necessarily going to be as, and obviously it depends on the context of the situation as well. It's not necessarily going to be as inappropriate as this board would like you to think. But the fact is, you need to sort of abide by strict moral and legal medical codes of conduct laid out by boards by governing bodies, I should say, like the GMC, to answer these questions, because ultimately that's what the board of examiners of the UCAT are basing their answers, the correct answers off. So to explain this one, the reason that it's very inappropriate is because, and I should highlight this, you're saying that to him, in case he has any questions, someone will answer them tomorrow before the surgery. So you're essentially saying that you're not going to tell him anything about why his surgery has been cancelled. You've just told him to go home without even telling him that the procedure has been cancelled. And not only is that wrong in a sort of moral, well, more medico-legal sense, but it's actually extremely morally wrong as well. It's said in the blurb that Benjamin's quite an anxious patient, and he's certainly very anxious about this procedure he's about to have. So just telling him to go home without any kind of reasoning behind it is actually a highly inappropriate thing to do. So I hope all of you guys understand that. And I should say, if any of you have any more specific questions about any of these scenarios, just put them in the chat and I'll do my best to answer them at the end of this presentation. So next question, please. Right, so 3, ask a medical student to deal with this and explain to Benjamin what is happening. So how appropriate is this?
I think it takes a bit of time for students to kind of get their head around what's being asked with these SJT type questions. And I think once you get into the routine of it and you get into it's a little bit like pattern recognition, isn't it?
Exactly.
You start to learn what they're looking for once you've done a few questions, don't you?
And the thing is, it's interesting what you say about pattern recognition, because actually a lot of the time with these questions, it's a specific part of the question itself in the sentence that they're asking you to focus on. And I'll touch back on that when I explain the answer to this one.
You want the results up?
Yes, please.
There you go.
Okay, interesting. Okay, fine. Happy to give the answer then. So again, this is very inappropriate. So most of you guys put inappropriate but not awful, and then there was sort of about, so that was about 50%, and then about 20-ish% put appropriate but not ideal and very inappropriate, and then a minority put very appropriate. Again, I can see why you put inappropriate but not awful, but there's a subtle sort of difference, which I'll explain now, as to why it is very inappropriate. I guess the reason why a lot of you put inappropriate but not awful was because, one, a medical student is technically part of the team. You know, when I go on placement, I'm technically part of the team, but the fact is they and I am not, you know, I'm not qualified to consent a patient. I'm not qualified to do a procedure. I'm not qualified to even tell them really in a medical legal sense why their procedure is being cancelled. And I think the reason, and this may not be the case for all of you, but the sort of vibe that I'm getting is that the reason you put C for this is because the second part of the question says that you'll also ask the medical student to explain what's happening. But I should point out that that is, I suppose red herring is the wrong word, but it's a sort of a little trick in the question that the examiners have put in there to try and throw you off. When you see anything that sort of throws red flags in your mind, and the red flag here is that you're asking a medical student to deal with this, because that's not right. Again, in a sort of ethical and legal sense, it's not the right thing to do. But then on the other side, you're asking them to fully explain what's happening. So in your head, you think that there's a sort of another side to the coin. And as I said, in real life, that's fair enough. But the fact is, for the purposes of this exam, and certainly for the purposes of this section of the UCAT, you need to think almost, you know, you almost need to pluck bits of the blurb and bits of the question out that you think rather are sort of red flags, or things that could directly contradict what is written in you know, something like good medical practice or any other kind of guideline for doctors or medical students. Okay, so next question, please. So the final bit of this part of the question. So tell Benjamin that his operation has been postponed until tomorrow, but this will have no impact on his safety. Is this appropriate or very inappropriate, or anything in between? Just quickly got a couple of questions here. So if he was an actual doctor, it would be appropriate to let him handle it. That's correct, yeah. So if he was a fully qualified doctor, ideally either a trainee surgeon or a consultant surgeon, then yes, it would be ethical and sort of valid to do that. Explain the person rather than the medical student. Yeah, I understand that. And sometimes that, in regard to wording the questions in a strange way, I can understand, but sometimes that does happen. But it's, as I said, it's important to try and get the clear points out of the question. But no, it does happen. And again, if you feel like you've messed something up, you just don't have enough time, so you have to move on, if that makes sense.
Right, okay, you ready for the results for this one?
Yeah. Okay, good. Yeah, so happy to share the answer. So most of you guys put very appropriate for this, over 50% of you, and that is definitely the correct answer here. So actually most of what is written in this part of the question is a sort of entirely appropriate thing for the surgical, I'm guessing it's a surgical trainee or junior doctor, I think it said in the blurb, doesn't really matter, for them to do. So the main points are, you're telling this patient, Benjamin, that his operation has been postponed. That's one, you're telling the truth. And importantly, you're telling him what's happening and explaining why, but this will have no impact on his safety. And again, that's a very subtle trick. The examiner's not really a trick, but it's a subtle kind of part of the question that the examiners are putting in there, because they put in the blurb that he's an anxious patient. They put in the blurb that he's really worried about having this procedure. I think the direct quote was, he just wants to get it over and done with. So by you saying this will have no impact on his safety, that's reassurance. And actually, you're sort of ticking two boxes there with that answer. You're doing the right thing by telling him that his operation's been postponed, and you're also comforting him and making sure that he's okay, and explaining the truth, that he's not going to suddenly die, and that he's not going to suddenly sort of go downhill. And that's the reason that's very appropriate. That's why that's distinguished from very appropriate to appropriate but not ideal, because you're sort of ticking off two important parts of the blurb there. So next question, please. And I'm sorry about the questions. There are just a bit too many to answer them all, but I'll aim to go over them at the end, and I'll try and put it back in the context of the question that I was doing, if that makes sense. So question 2, it's a Sunday afternoon, and Bianca, a medical student, is rushing through the hospital since she is quite late for a clinical placement session. The hospital is very quiet. Suddenly she stops because she sees an unknown liquid spilt on the floor. She's already late for her placement, but she's unsure what to do about the spilt liquid. So just before we answer the questions, let's just quickly recap what we did for the first blurb. Let's look at the salient points, the main points for the blurb. And again, I can't stress this enough. This is a proper exam technique that I recommend that you do in the actual thing. It's not to say that you skim read it, but you need to be able to take up the main points from the blurb that they give you. So it's a weekend, that's important. You're a medical student, you're not qualified yet, and you're very busy. You're late for your clinical placement session, so you might be getting in trouble. The hospital's very quiet. There's not many people there on a Sunday afternoon, and you've noticed that an unknown sort of undescript liquid is spilt on the floor. You're already late for placement, and you're unsure about what to do with the spilt liquid. So the important points here: you don't know what the spilt liquid is, and you're running late for placement, and also you're a medical student and the hospital's quiet. So first question, please. So how important are the following considerations for Bianca when making a decision on this situation? And that's another important thing I should say before you get and this was the same for the last question, before you get the breakdown, the numbered breakdown of questions, they're always going to ask you a broader, larger question. In this context, it's how important are the following considerations? It could be how appropriate is this act, like in the last question. It could be something like how morally justifiable is this? The list goes on. But the fact is, they're going to ask you a broader question and then split it down into mini questions. So the first part, so that someone can slip over and hurt themselves even though the hospital is very quiet. So how important is that to consider in this situation? And just a reminder, you're a medical student and you found some liquid on the floor in the hospital. And hopefully this should be quite obvious.
Yeah, the votes come in very quickly for this one, so
cool.
Should be quite a clear one. Let me just share those results for you.
Yeah, brilliant. So 84% of you put very important. That's brilliant. So can we reveal the answer, please? Okay, so the
The
squares
box is out
gone
in the
on,
way,
yeah,
but
the box has gone
yeah,
on the right thing, but it is of course very important. You guys are all correct. And again, this is something I touched upon in the last question, but the examiners have tried to throw you off again by saying, even though the hospital is very quiet. But what you really need to latch onto here is the fact that someone can slip over and hurt themselves. It doesn't matter whether the hospital is quiet or busy or whatever. It's the fact that that could happen in the first place. And I hope that that one's quite obvious. And judging by the reactions of all of you, seem that you will get it. So next question, please. So this one's a little bit more tricky. So this one is the fact that she is running late for her clinical placement. So how important is that one?
Yeah, this is a bit more split. It's a bit more tricky, this, isn't it?
Yeah.
Give it a couple more seconds. Lots of votes on this one. Okay, I'll share the results.
Okay, so quite split. Fine. Okay, so happy to show the answer. So it was sort of, I mean, most of you put important, but running very closely behind was of minor importance, which is the right answer. Again, I can explain this in detail. And again, I can understand why you guys put important, and probably being the studious people that you are wanting to apply for medicine, you know, you'd think that being late is not good. But the reason that of minor importance is the right answer in this situation is to do with the fact that the liquid itself could be a potential hazard, either a trip hazard, as was mentioned in the first question, or a chemical hazard. It's important to note that in the blurb they gave you, they specifically said you don't know what this liquid is. This is an unknown liquid found on the floor. It could be anything. Healthcare professionals use all sorts of chemicals in a hospital environment, and it could be potentially dangerous for many different reasons. I suppose the reason why they haven't said it's not important at all is because obviously your medical education is important, and it's important to be punctual, and it's important to be professional at all times. But as with everything in this SJT section of the UCAT, it's about prioritization. And you need to, the key for this, and this is a tricky question, and the reality is it is going to be split with the answers, but you need to be able to sort of rationalize why, rationalize and prioritize the fact that there is a sort of safety hazard there over the fact that you are running late. And the fact that you're running late in itself is not something that's life-threatening. It's something that you can just apologize to your seniors too. So that's another important distinction. But I appreciate this question is slightly trickier. So next one,
yeah,
please.
I think you've got to think like. No, I was just going to add to that as well. You've got to think like almost like a doctor and not like a medical student for some of these types of things as well. You know, you might think as a student or as a medical student, oh my God, I'm going to be late. The consultant, is going to be really angry at me. But if you think like a doctor, oh, there's something on the floor, I need to make sure that patient safety issue is dealt with. I'll apologize to the consultant when I get there. It's like a different mindset sometimes, and you've got to almost think a little bit like a doctor rather than the medical student that you're going to be. And that would be accepted by a consultant. So, that's why it probably takes it down from importance to of minor importance here as well.
I definitely reiterate what Mark said. And the fact is, these, as I said before, these questions are based on real guidelines and legislation for doctors, not for medical students. Medical students, although you have to adhere to a code of conduct, you don't have a sort of set sort of regulation, set regulations in place that you need to follow, which is why I'd recommend to all of you to just go on the GMC and have a read. So next question, please. Is there one more, or are we done?
I think so.
Okay, one more. So how important is the fact that it's not her job to clean the hospital? And just to remind you, you're a medical student and you found an unknown liquid on the floor. And again, hopefully this one should be quite obvious.
think they're getting it now. There's a very clear answer for this one.
Yeah, this is quite a clear one, I think.
Let's give it a couple more seconds just for the last few votes. Okay, I'll share the results.
Brilliant. Okay, so 89% of you picked the right answer, which we can hopefully select. Yeah, and hopefully, again, I hope that this one is obvious. Just because it's not your job per se to do something doesn't mean you shouldn't, especially in the context of this liquid, because as I said before, this could literally be anything. This could be sort of harsh chemical producing fumes that could hurt people. This could be something that people could slip over. It's a genuine hazard, and as such, it needs to be treated with respect, and you need to sort of put your pride to one side and make sure you do the right thing and either clean it up or talk to the right person to get it clean. Now, just touching upon a more broader topic, actually, I'm sure the sort of more observant amongst you would have noticed that a lot of these questions are quite obvious, but a lot of them are also extremely vague and extremely down to interpretation. And what's important to sort of note is that the questions aren't going to be weighted the same. There are ones that are going to be more obvious, such as this question number 3. And the converse is also true. There are going to be ones where you're going to have to think more. So what I would recommend, and going back to the timing thing, you only have 26 minutes. So you need to make sure that, you really do, if you find a question that is obvious like this, that you just select the right answer and you move on and you don't kind of overthink it. And I know that's easier said than done. And I was certainly guilty of doing that when I did the UCAT and the SJT. But it's important to realize that, you will be tough on time. You will be sort of, hard on time if you do beat around the bush. Someone's asked, would cleaning it up yourself be acceptable? So probably not, I'll be honest. But again, it depends on the context of the question they give you. For example, if they said in the question that, everyone you've asked has just turned their nose up at you or just said, don't do it yourself, then that would be acceptable. But obviously, it's more acceptable to go and report it because it's not that it's not your job, but you could also be putting yourself at risk by you don't know what the chemical is. I hope that answers your question. So I think that's the questions done. Is that correct?
Yeah, I think the only thing I was going to mention is it's obviously just our own little plug about the crash course. It is really tricky. The SJT and the whole UCAT is tricky, and unless you know some of these kind of tricks and you get people to actually talk through them, it can be really difficult. I know you mentioned the UCAT book. I'll try and find a link for that, and I'll send it out in the email that we send out afterwards as well. It's a really, really good starting point is to grab one of those UCAT books and read about the UCAT. I know there's loads of online question banks as well. There are question banks on the UCAT website as well that are all completely free. So we 100% recommend doing that as well. But if you do want a bit more help, where we basically spend a full day doing this kind of thing, going through questions, doing lots of polls, and you want a bit more help, then we do have the kind of crash course there as well. There's a discount code on there if you want to use that. I'd recommend just taking a picture with your phone or something, just so you've got a copy of that discount code, because it goes off once the slide obviously goes off. It's tricky. We know it's tricky. We'll give you as much kind of free advice as we can in the space of an hour on a webinar. But if you want just a bit more help, just go and have a look at one of those. Cool. Should we do some questions? Should we have a look through the Q&A side of things, and we'll try and get through a few of those.
So
I might have to
sorry, Mark,
stop my screen share just for a second because I can't launch the Q&As otherwise. Okay, cool. Yeah. So I've got the Q&A up here. Do you want me to read them out, or have you got them up there, or how do you want to do it?
I've got them, if that's okay.
Yeah, sure, go for it.
Cool. So I'll try and go for the first ones first, try and make it fair. So So Alice, do we assume that each question is independent? So Benjamin being explained to or told to go home a separate option, sorry, and not consecutive. Yes, yeah, you do. You assume that each question is independent. But again, important to realize all in the context of the blurb that they give you. And it's important to realize that that blurb is not going to, the situation doesn't change, if that makes sense, as you go along doing the questions. The situation always remains the same, hence the name Situational Judgement Test. It's just the only difference is the follow-up questions that they ask. So I thought we meant to explain to the person rather than the student. So I answered that. How to distinguish between very appropriate and appropriate but not ideal. So I guess that kind of harks back to what I was saying earlier about picking out red flags or picking out important parts of the answer or the question that they give you, which give that away. And again, I would, as I say, the more that you do of these, the better that you get. It is really true. And that's, I can kind of give you nuggets of wisdom or nuggets of experience that I've done, but no amount of kind of nuggets of wisdom coming from my mouth will actually ultimately improve your own scores and your own output. That can only be done through your own kind of practice. But then those, extra things that I'm telling you now will help once you put the sort of groundwork in. But to answer your question, it harks back to finding those red flag things and those things that directly contradict what is written in good medical practice or written in NICE guidelines or some other medical legislation. And usually it's quite clear in most questions, but as we found out, there are some questions where it is a bit of a gray area. But it's important not to waste too much time, as I said before.
I don't know if you've got the actual Q&A tool up as well. I know there's the chat box where there's some like typed ones. In the Q&A, there's people have voted on a couple of those as well, so we can see some really popular questions.
I'm just seeing now, yeah. Okay, cool. So I'm happy to answer that. So when's the best time to book your UCAT? That's completely dependent on your particular circumstance and your own situation. There isn't a good time to do it. If you want to be really, general about it, I would do it before the start of the school term, because you don't want to be coinciding your UCAT exam with the rest of your personal statement, the rest of all the other stuff you have to do for medical school admissions, your interview prep. You want to make sure that you space yourself and give yourself enough time to rest in between each thing. So for example, when I did it in early August, and then obviously went back to school. And then from what I remember, I sent off my UCAS in late or mid to late September or something like that. So I had a month where I could just purely work on stuff like my personal statement and my overall application and where I wanted to apply as well. It's really important. The one thing I would say is if you do it before term starts, your score. And, as I said before, different universities value the UCAT in different ways. Edinburgh doesn't value your score as much. They value the situational judgment, what we've gone over today. Somewhere like St George's or King's, where I go, they value the raw score more. But what I'm saying is, once you have that score and once you know what you've got, you can be more strategic about where you'd like to apply and be realistic with yourself as well. So Melba, I have mocks late June. Should I start preparing for the UCAT now? So again, that depends on the specific, I don't want to put words in anyone's mouth. It depends on the specific circumstances of your school. So it depends whether those mocks in your school's eyes are the same grades that go on your UCAS application form or not. In my school, they weren't. Although they correlated, they weren't. The grades that you got weren't the exact same grades they put on the form. But if that's true for you, then it's probably best to just focus on that and then give yourself a month or 2 months to thoroughly go over the UCAT in detail and practice a lot, and then say do it in July or August. That would be my advice. But again, I don't, it's completely dependent on your situation. So where can we find UCAT practice resources? I mean, we've pretty much answered that. And obviously here at Medical Projects, there's a really, really good UCAT crash course that we offer. And there are other mini free 1-hour webinars like this one where we sort of go over the basics of each section. But what I would say, and Mark said this earlier, is the fact is, if you do go to one of the courses, things will be explained in a lot more detail. you'll have a lot more time. It'll be more like, you know, one-on-one tutoring where you'll actually be able to get individual feedback. And like today, I'm not going to be able to answer every question, but if you do on the course, every question that you have and every sort of permutation will be accounted for and answered. So how many hours should I study to prevent burnout? So I'm going to answer this in the context of the UCAT exam. That's a wider question for other types of exams and life in general. But in regard to the UCAT itself, I put in one of the earlier slides the concept of doing little and often. I think that's really, really important for this type of exam. This isn't something that you can cram, and I can't stress that enough. This isn't something that you can learn and memorize out of textbook. You need to practice your technique and hone your technique, almost as if you're sort of learning a new skill or learning a craft or something. And the more that you do it, the more you'll be able to pick out those salient points, those important points, and then answer the questions correctly, or more correctly, I should say. So to answer your question, I'd recommend maybe doing sort of an hour or two here and there when you can, and then doing that more regularly once the exam's looming. And again, this links back to a previous question, which sort of said, how much time should I give myself? When should I sit it? Well, you should really be aiming to give yourself at least a month before sitting the actual exam, where you can sort of diligently go through and regularly study the techniques involved for each section. And that's still true for the SJT.
I think that's a really good analogy, by the way, about it's like a skill, it's like a craft. And when you were saying that, I almost kind of imagined someone trying to learn how to play the guitar. I mean, if you just go into the UCAT and you've never picked up a guitar before, it's going to be a bit of a disaster. But if you've given it at least a month, 6 weeks, 8 weeks worth of practice, you know, you might be able to play at least, you know, a half decent tune. I think that's a really good way to think about it. And that's just a really good way to think about it. I like that.
So what is the average score that you should get to keep a lot of uni options open? So I'll answer that for both the band system and the SJ and for the overall score. I noticed someone in the chat earlier also asked about something along the lines of whether they're separate. And I did answer this in a previous slide, but just to reiterate, that is entirely true. So you'll get a main score, which is out of 3,600 technically. I think the maximum points you can get is 900 for each section. And then you can divide that by 4 to find out your sort of average score for each section. But then the SJT, the bit that we've gone over today briefly, is a band system, with band 1 being the best and band 4 being the worst. And then to answer your question, you should be aiming for a band 2 or above realistically, especially nowadays where medical school admissions are very tough, very competitive. And in regard to your actual score, that's really dependent on the universities themselves. What I would say is that the average, it's done on a normal distribution curve, and the average score each year always varies. So a good score is always going to vary. So I can't give you a definitive answer, but what I would say is anything really above an average of 650 is usually good, or good enough to be realistically competitive. But really, you know, it'd be good to aim for higher.
Yeah, we were doing some analysis on the 2020 results literally today, actually. So I've got some figures for the averages for the UCAT. So in 2020, the average score was 2,511, which is an average score of 628. Now that basically puts you bang in the middle of that distribution curve that you're talking about. So if you want to be towards the good score, 650 plus is where you want to be pushing towards that way. That will do you for most universities. If you want to get super competitive and be kind of applying to somewhere like Newcastle that puts a lot of weight on it, then you want to be looking above the 700s. But you really need to be down with your revision to be pushing 700, 725s and things.
Yeah, just to reiterate that, anything above 700, really, I would say is competitive for providing you've got a band 1 or 2, is really competitive for most universities out there, because it usually puts you in the top decile, so the top 10% of people on that curve. I can say that from my own personal experience, because I think I got, from memory, I got 700 exactly. And obviously the exam was slightly different back then, but that literally put me just within the top 10%. So that's usually around the sort of boundary, but I can't stress enough, it changes every year. The exams of a varying difficulty every year, so I can't give you a sort of definitive answer.
Yeah, just to let you know, for the top 10%, the top kind of decile in 2020, you would have had to score 712.5, so let's say 713 to be in the top 10% last year. So
Yep.
if you're up there in that top decile, you're doing well.
Yep. Cool. So how do you balance the UCAT with other commitments, e.g. part-time job learning to drive school responsibilities? So yeah, this is a really important question. It's something that I had to, take time to think about when I was in sixth form. I mean, I was doing all of these things, I think, when I was in sixth form as well. But the fact is, and this is even truer now than when I did it. And I've only just finished my second year. I didn't apply to medicine long ago, but even now, in the space in between when I applied and now, it's already become a lot more competitive. And the truth is, with COVID, a lot of people are, applying because it's seen as a very noble thing now to become a doctor with the current climate with COVID. So to answer your question, realistically, you need to make sacrifices if you want to be competitive with a medical school application. I'm not going to mince my words. You need to be prepared to sacrifice time doing other. This isn't in no way to say that you need to reject your hobbies and reject learning how to drive. It's not like that. You need to make sure that the sacrifice lies in your sort of organization and your commitment. So I was using that phrase little and often, and it's something that I personally sort of live by, and it is really important in this case. As I said before, learning the technique for the UCAT for this webinar, the SJT, but it's the same for the rest of the sections. It's like learning a skill, and it takes time to appreciate every single different permutation of questions that they give you. And it takes time to build up your technique, and you simply can't do that by cramming it at the end. So what I mean to say is that, sure, it's really important to keep your well-being up and to keep your other commitments and responsibilities, and also important to show that you're an all-rounded person for your medical school applications. But you need to, and obviously this is dependent on everyone's personal situations, but you need to be critically aware of your priorities. I think that's the best way of putting it, and make sure that if you want to be serious about it, that you prioritize your application.
I think we've probably got time for maybe 2 more questions, then we'll probably have to wrap
Cool.
it up. So I don't know if you want to just take the kind of next 2.
Sure, I'll take the next 2. Yeah. So what is the best free website to practice questions on, and when should we start using those questions? I'll be honest, there aren't many question banks that are free. Unfortunately, that's the way the world works. There are, I'm not actually sure about that one. I mean, coming to this webinar today is probably winning half the battle in regards to getting a sort of overview, and in regards to getting a taster of what it's like, and some sort of tips and tricks. But what I'd say is, unfortunately, most of those things are paid for. The books are all paid for. It depends how much money you want to spend. As Mark just said, the course that we do here is reasonably priced, and there are other courses that you can look up as well. They're all on the internet. But to answer your question, there isn't really free resources per se. I mean, you can go on, I think there's, I think it's Medic Portal. They may have a few sample questions, but I stress that they'll always give you free sample questions. They're not going to give you the whole lot there for free, but you can certainly, do the sample questions at your leisure. Okay, so the final question, because each question is worth 2 marks, would you get 1 mark if you still weighed in on the right side? So this is an important distinction to make, and actually, thank you for bringing this up, because I didn't touch upon it. But from what I gather, that's actually true. So if you don't get the most appropriate answer judged by the panel, if you get one on each side, you can still pick up a small amount of marks. It's not just judged purely on, you know, for example, how my exams are done, where one answer will give you the mark and the rest won't. And that's also therefore I think it makes the exam fairer, and it sort of justifies the panel's opinions about what is right and wrong, because obviously that is in their expert opinion, their opinion. But as we discovered earlier with some of the more grey area questions that aren't as clear cut, that's how they make it fair, by sort of giving you the benefit of the doubt in a way. So you're right, Madeline. But I don't think it's as simple as getting 1 mark instead of 2. I'm not sure how they weigh it, and a lot of the way that they actually weigh the marks and calculate the stats and the distribution itself, they're not necessarily going to release to the public, because people will do all sorts of things to the stats. So yeah, so I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, I think it's some of the key points just to take from this evening are it is tricky, but it's perfectly manageable with a lot of practice and understanding the technique. And I think if we can kind of leave everybody with that analogy of the learning a craft and a skill, I think that's a really good thing to kind of take away from this evening. You've got to build up your UCAT craft over the next weeks and months. We'll be running more kind of free workshops like this. You know, like I said, you can join the course if you want, if you find that you're struggling still. Feel free to check out the YouTube channel, where we've got other things about the UCAT as well. There's loads of free stuff there. There's loads of free stuff on our articles and blogs as well. So taking all that content for free, and then we're here if you need a bit more help as well. Yeah, I'd just like to say thank you, Matthew, for joining us this evening, giving up an hour of your time. Really appreciate it, and it's really insightful to kind of hear from somebody who did really well on the UCAT. So we appreciate it, and yeah, enjoy the rest of your evening, and we'll see you again on our kind of future webinars and future courses, hopefully.
Brilliant. Thank you, everyone.
All right. Thanks, everybody else. We'll see you in a couple of weeks on the next webinar. Have a nice evening, and yeah, we'll see you in a couple of weeks. Cheers.
Bye.
Bye.